So a lot of people know my content from things where I'm complaining about iconic cards not being good in competitive play. A lot of people see me as a negative YouTuber, but in reality, I think it's very cool when positive things happen in certain archetypes or certain strategies, and I'm starting this new series, something I've been working on for a while now, although admittedly, I have not come up with a perfect title, so the title of this video might change depending on your guys' suggestions, but basically what I want to do in the next coming weeks, coming months, is start this new series talking about not necessarily terrible cards, but really great cards that saw tons of competitive play sort of stuck in bad archetypes. And I know a lot of people sort of half-jokingly compare this to Legacy of the Worthless and Archetype Archive, but how this differs from those, I mean, besides the fact that we're not covering every single card in those archetypes that we're talking about, is that Legacy of the Worthless is about really bad archetypes with almost no good cards, and Archetype Archive is very different because that actually talks about decks that, while not very competitive, actually do have some merit and could be played in a more rogue fashion. However, what I'm talking about is decks that are almost entirely made of completely trash cards, except for a handful of them that actually saw tons of competitive success. The first theme that I want to talk about is Ally of Justice, and I know that a lot of people think that this deck is really bad, and they're not entirely wrong. This is a dual terminal archetype that mostly is just pack filler for the hidden arsenal sets. Of course, a lot of people know about Ally of Justice Catastro, but that's not the only Ally of Justice card that actually saw competitive play. In today's video, we're going to focus on cards that actually saw real tournament results. We're not focusing on cards that are good in theory. These are cards that are all proven successful cards, and that is very important when looking at them because these aren't things that we're speculating about. These are older cards that did see play format after format after format in some cases. First up, we have Ally of Justice Catastro, originally released in 2009, and this is possibly one of the best level 5 synchro monsters, or at least for a long time. This is a level 5 synchro monster that's completely generic. It's a dark machine monster, and it says at the start of the damage step, if this card battles a non-dark monster, destroy that monster. And I know that by 2019 standards, no one's gonna play this card, but this thing was so strong for years, like 4 years. This was like the go-to level 5 synchro monster. Even in the combo decks that were playing cards like TG Hyper Librarian, they were still playing Ally of Justice Catastro because I know this might seem weird nowadays, but monster removal, especially from extra deck cards, was very limited for a long time. I've talked at length about rank 4 monsters and how we now know them to be very versatile in removing cards, but back in the day you had to use things like Maystroke and Photon Palpable Operative to actually get over big monsters. Synchro monsters are sort of the same thing. Nowadays we have tons of synchros, so many cards that actually can just kill cards on the field, but Ally of Justice Catastro was one of the original ones as far as synchro monsters go, and for a long time it was the only level 5 synchro monster that a lot of players used. This thing, for all intents and purposes, just says if this thing attacks a monster, blow it up, and that's a pretty darn good effect. Of course, it can't kill everything. If it attacks a dark monster, that doesn't actually work, but in a lot of cases that didn't really come up too often. And it wasn't just during the synchro era that we saw Ally of Justice Catastro, because even when Xyz Summoning came out, people were still playing this card. It wasn't just a card you threw in your extra deck because you had extra space. It was a card that was like very good against one of the best cards of the format, Wind Up Zenmaines, and Wind Up Zenmaines had a very annoying effect to deal with, but Ally of Justice Catastro could actually burn through 2 of the material on the Zenmaines with just 1 attack. They'd have to detach once because you destroy it with its effect, and then you have to detach a second time because you were destroying it in battle. That was a pretty good way to actually push through these Zenmaines. It was a pretty unique card to actually out a very popular choice. And while Ally of Justice Catastro isn't good anymore and hasn't been good for a few years now, you really do have to realize that when you go back and look at the decks that came out after this card was in the game, all the way through like 2012, you can almost always find Catastro in someone's extra deck. It really is that ubiquitous. So many people played this card, and even if you just played a couple hand traps like Effect Filler and then any level 4 monsters, people still played this card just on the off chance that they had a level 4 and then they could normal summon an Effect Filler just to remove a monster on the opponent's side of the field. But Ally of Justice Catastro was not the only Ally of Justice synchro monster that saw competitive use. In 2014, so we're a few years after Catastro is sort of seen its heyday, we have Ally of Justice Decisive Armor, and this card came out in 2010, but it wasn't until 2014 when people actually started playing this card competitively. The main format that we're looking at here is Hat format, and one of the decks that was around in Hat format was Lightsworns, and if you could did make this card against the Lightsworn deck, you won almost instantaneously. So this is a level 10 Synchro monster with 3300 attack and 3300 defense. It takes 1 tuner plus 2 or more non-tuner monsters, kind of like Trishula, and it says once per turn, if your opponent controls a face-up light monster or monsters, you can activate one of these effects. I'm only going to skip to the third effect here because that's the one that's important. It says send all cards in your hand to the graveyard to look at your opponent's hand, and send all light monsters in their hand to the graveyard, then inflict damage to your opponent equal to the total attack of the opponent's monsters sent to the graveyard. That basically just means if you summon this against Lightsworn and they have a full hand and it will most likely be all light monsters, you just win the game instantly. And even if it doesn't do quite enough damage, now you have a 3300 attack monster on the field. The types of decks that would play this thing would be Lightsworns and Sylvans and sometimes Dragon Lords if they could fit it in, but overall it's important to know that this card was a very unique extra deck monster that countered a specific popular deck in the meta, and that really does go to show that while the Ally of Justice archetype as a whole didn't really work with the whole anti-light theme, the extra deck monster specifically, when there is a light deck in the meta, can definitely be very powerful. Ally of Justice Cycle Reader was a card that popped up for years, and yet a lot of people don't even know it exists. So this is a level 3 tuner with 1000 attack and 1000 defense. This is actually a hand trap. It says during either player's turn, you can discard this card to the graveyard, then target up to 2 light monsters in your opponent's graveyard, banish those targets. So there's a lot to unpack with this card because it might look deceptively simple on the surface, but in reality there are a ton of cool things that you can do with this card that you can't do with other hand traps. The big benefit from this card, and we haven't really seen this repeated, is that this is a machine monster that you can search with Gear Gigant X. That meant when this card was first being played in 2014, any Geargia players could search this card out on their first turn against a Lightsworn opponent. What's especially cool about the interaction is that Gear Gigant X can actually add cards from the grave to the hand as well, so you would only have to search one copy of it and then you could just recycle it every single turn. This also was extremely powerful heading into the latter half of 2014 after hat format, and even early 2015 because this card was exceptional against decks like Satellar Knights that had a lot of lights in the graveyard. One of the cool things about this card is that you don't have to banish 2, you can banish up to 2. So if your opponent did the Satellar Knight Deneb first turn and then they sent it to the graveyard, if they tried to revive that one copy of Deneb with no other light monsters in their graveyard when they summoned Satellar Knight Altier, you could use this card to summon that one copy of Deneb and effectively shut down their entire engine. But keep in mind, this card wasn't only good against decks like Lightsworns, and it wasn't only good against decks like Satellar Knights. This card actually saw play through 2016. That's insane to think about, and a lot of people don't even know this card exists. So this card was played at the latter half of 2016, first against Blue Eyes, but then against ABCs, and once again, like I just said, ABCs are a machine deck, so they can play Gear Gigant X, and then they can search this card and recycle it over and over again. Ally of Justice Cycle Reader is a very good hand trap, and a lot of people forgot about it, but it could come back in the meta if we see a light strategy sort of taking over. Right now, it seems like we have a lot of dark monsters, but if there is a light strategy in the metagame that revolves around cards in the graveyard, this could be like a super DD Crow. I mean, it banishes 2 monsters, and that's a very, very effective against certain light decks. And that brings us to the final Ally of Justice card that saw competitive play, and that is Ally of Justice Quarantine. So this is a dark level 4 monster with 1700 attack points and 1200 defense points, and it has a very simple sentence. It just says neither player can special summon light monsters. So where was this card played? Well, it wasn't played for a long time, even though it came out in 2010. The first time we really saw this card come into the metagame was 2016 against Blue Eyes, and then eventually against ABC. Once again, we saw deck lists that were playing both this card and Cycle Reader because both of them are searchable with Gear Gigant X. When you were going second, the Ally of Justice Cycle Reader was very effective against both ABCs and Blue Eyes, but when you were going first, Quarantine was very powerful, maybe even more powerful than Cycle Reader because it just prevented them from doing anything at all. Especially as a tech against Blue Eyes, that deck really doesn't have any big normal summons, and a lot of the times they just literally wouldn't have an out to this card. What makes Quarantine so exciting though is that if you weren't playing light monsters, this card was infinitely better than something like Fossil Dyna because it meant that you could still perform your normal special summons just as long as they weren't light monsters. Anyway though, all I had to talk about in today's video were those 4 Ally of Justice cards. I'm not saying this deck is super influential. It's not like the best archetype in history, and most of the cards you wouldn't actually want to play in your deck. However, that doesn't mean that the entire archetype is complete trash, and in fact, these 4 cards all saw competitive success, which means that I really want to talk about them and highlight some hidden gems in an otherwise terrible archetype. If you guys have any suggestions for archetypes that I should cover in this series, definitely let me know in the comment section below. I already have a list of archetypes that I'm going to talk about. I think a lot of them are going to be the ones that you guys are going to say, but I'm always open to feedback. And also, if you have any suggestions for the title of this new series, let me know as well, because I'm not really set in stone on what this video or this series is called. Anyway, I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching today's new series video. Goodbye.